Good morning, everybody. I'm Avik, President of the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity. I want to welcome you heartily to the 2023 edition of the Freedom and Progress Conference. So as some of you know, if you've been to our website, why do we call this conference the Freedom and Progress Conference? We call it the Freedom and Progress Conference inspired by a speech that Frederick Douglass, one of the greatest Americans of all time, gave in 1870. He was asked by a bunch of newly freed slaves, what should we do? Should we only vote for Republicans because Republicans freed the slaves, or should we feel free to vote for Democrats when we want to? And Frederick Douglass said, well, look, you should vote your conscience, because that's what we fought for. We fought for people to be able to vote for whichever party they wanted to vote for. But I, speaking for myself, will always be a member of the party of freedom and progress, by which he meant he would always be a Republican. Now, what happened to the Republican Party that freed the slaves? It used to be that the Republican Party got the majority of the black vote. And then after FDR was elected with the New Deal, he attracted a majority of the black vote because there were a lot of people who couldn't get jobs in the private sector in the North or the South. And the federal government started to employ people and give people certain kinds of assistance. And then in 1964, when Martin Luther King gave that speech, or around the time Martin Luther King gave that speech, in that presidential election, the Republican nominee was opposed to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Everyone in this room shares Dr. King's aspiration that we have a country where we're judged by not the content of our skin or the color of our skin, but the content of our character. And yet, unfortunately, in those days, what Martin Luther King was advocating for was controversial. There were a lot of conservative intellectuals as well who were opposed to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Bill Buckley was opposed to it. Robert Bork was opposed to it. William Rehnquist was opposed to it. So there was a controversy at that time. And the Republican Party has paid the price. Ever since that 1964 election, the African-American vote has been solidly Democratic. And as a result, there hasn't been a competition for the black vote, even though many African-Americans care about freedom and progress. And many of the people in this room, Republican or Democrat, care about freedom and progress. Of course, politics changes over time. What you see here is that as we go through the next several presidential cycles, millennials and Gen Z will start to dominate the electorate. Millennials are already technically the largest component of the electorate. They're not the ones who vote at the highest rates. That's still the boomers and Gen X. But over time, the views of millennials and Gen Z will reflect presidential elections. So it's really important to both understand how millennials and Gen Z think and to think about what is the future of freedom and progress in a world in which they are running the country. Younger generations are far less religious. So to the degree that our politics are dominated by a lot of culture war questions or cultural debates about the role of religion, religious liberty, culture, these things are very important. We have to understand that as the electorate changes and millennials and Gen Z are a bigger part of it, we're going to have an electorate in which there's fewer actively religious people and more secular people. How does that affect the way people think about freedom and progress? And this is another way to think about it, which is the major polling firms like Gallup and Pew, they ask this question very simply. They ask, what are your feelings about capitalism versus socialism? And if you ask baby boomers or older by about a 2-to-1 margin, they say they're for capitalism versus being for socialism, and same with Gen X. But if you ask millennials the same question, it's about 50-50. And it didn't used to be 50-50. It's become 50-50. Why is that? Now, those with the culture war thesis would say it's all about schools and how kids are being educated today. But there's another important element of this problem, and that is economics. So you all have heard of long COVID, but there's another form of long COVID that's arguably more dangerous to the country than the medical form of long COVID. And that is what the pandemic did to our national debt. So this chart is showing you the federal debt as a share of our annual economic output, or GDP. You see the big spikes for World War I and the Great Depression and World War II. And then the financial crisis. We spent a lot of money during the financial crisis, and then we spent a lot of money in pandemic relief. Here's what the Congressional Budget Office says the projected debt-to-GDP ratio is. And that little sliver at the top, the light blue, that's the 2023 projection versus a 2022 projection. That little slice is $13 trillion. So our federal debt today is $32 trillion. That little slice of blue up there, that's $13 trillion. We're going to have a $100 trillion debt very soon. And by the way, what's driving the federal debt? It used to be the answer was healthcare spending, right? So if you look at healthcare spending, it's the only thing that's growing as a share of federal spending. Spending on national defense is basically flat as a share of our economy. Spending on all the other things, highways, roads, education, flat or even declining as a share of national spending. What's increasing? The only category that's really increasing is healthcare spending, and one other category. Interest on the federal debt. So we're never going to get to 2098 on this chart. By the way, this is a projection that's based on all the laws on the books staying the same. So if any laws change, if we have another crisis in the future like COVID or like the financial crisis, these charts could get much worse. And these charts also assume that interest rates stay relatively constant, that they don't get worse over time. I think the long-term interest rate that the Congressional Budget Office assumes is something like 4.5%. Do we really think when the interest on the federal debt is equal to federal health care spending that the interest rate that people charge us is 4.5%? There's no chance. Here's another way to think about this. So this blue curve is what we spend on national defense, and the orange is what we spend on interest on the federal debt. In 6 years, in 2029, according to the Congressional Budget Office, again, the nonpartisan scorekeeper in Washington, we will be spending more on interest on the federal debt than we spend on national defense. To me, that's a tipping point. And why does that matter? How does that actually affect ordinary people? We'll get to that. So how does the U.S. borrow? I mean, how do we finance this debt that we have? It's not like when you take out a mortgage and when you take out a mortgage, there's a bank like Wells Fargo or Chase where you ask them to lend you the money for your house. Let's say you're buying a $300,000 house. You ask Chase for a loan, and they either say yes or no. Well, there's no bank of planet Earth that lends $32 trillion to the United States. So what do? We slice that $32 trillion into $100 or $1,000 increments called bonds, and we sell them to people. And if you buy one of those treasury bonds, you're basically lending $100 or $1,000 to the United States. And so by dividing our debt into those little pieces, other people can lend us money. Someone can lend us $100, someone can lend us $1 billion. It depends on how many of those bonds that you own. But the quality of those bonds is going down because more and more investors are concluding that they won't get paid back if they lend too much money to the United States. And so what's happening is the share of the treasury bonds that we're issuing, in other words, the money that we're borrowing from the world, the share of those bonds the share of that lending that's happening due to foreign and international investors is declining. So it used to be, and it still is, that a lot of the people who lend us money are foreign governments or foreign banks, like the government of Japan or Deutsche Bank or what have you, right? These are the people who buy the treasury bonds and lend us money. But the share, they're basically gradually saying, you know what? I'm going to still lend money to the United States, but I'm going to lend less than I used to lend. And what that means in a normal market is interest rates go up. Just like if you have a bad credit score and your credit card interest rates go up, same happens with bond markets. If you are less creditworthy, if you're more at risk of default, of being bankrupt, people buy less of your bonds, fewer of your bonds, and your interest rates go up. But our government doesn't want interest rates to go up more than they already have because that would crash the stock market and the economy and all sorts of things. So what do? How do we solve this problem? The Federal Reserve has decided to lend the money to the United States to pay off its debts. Now, wait a minute, you might ask. Why is it that the federal government can lend money to the federal government? How does that work exactly? Well, the way the Federal Reserve does it is that it creates new US dollars out of thin air, trillions of them. and then says, here you go, here's the money that we're going to lend you. Now, how exactly would that work? It's kind of like if you have a credit card bill, and then instead of paying off your credit card bill, you take out a second credit card to pay off their first credit card. That's basically what the US government is doing. So what happens? How does that work exactly? When you increase the number of dollars in circulation in order to lend more money to the US, how does that affect the economy? Well, here's a way of illustrating it. So in 2001, there were $5 trillion in circulation as measured by the M2 money stock, which is a measure that economists use to measure the money supply. And we could spend hours on the topic of exactly how to do this. I won't bother you with that today. In 2009, after the financial crisis, we had $8.5 trillion in circulation. In 2022, we had $22 trillion in circulation. So all else being equal, that's a lot of money in circulation. In theory, like if I say I'm 6 feet tall, if I say I'm 12 feet tall, and that just means I've redefined what a foot is, right? It doesn't mean that I'm actually taller. And that's what happens when you increase the money supply. So Milton Friedman, the famous Nobel laureate economist, his argument, one that a lot of economists subscribe to, is that the key thing to look at is how the economy is growing relative to the size of the money supply. And what you see when you look at GDP here, in the 1990s, the economy grew faster than the money supply. So you want to know why the economy in the 90s was so successful, so great? One of the reasons was the economy grew faster than the money supply, which means the purchasing power of every dollar actually went up. But starting with the financial crisis and ever since, we've massively increased the number of dollars in circulation at a much faster pace than the economy has grown. And what does that mean? That means each dollar has less purchasing power than it had before. The standard term for that is inflation. Here's one way to think about inflation. These are the components of the Consumer Price Index for all urban consumers, or CPIU, that the government measures to look at inflation. And some people call this the chart of the century. Our colleague Mark Perry at AEI was the first person to represent some of these components this way. Here's our version of that chart. And what it's showing you is that the cost of living for Americans has increased, but it's increased in specific ways. So things like technology, cell phones, TVs, those things have gone down a lot in price. Clothes and food have basically stayed pretty stable. So those are the kinds of things that are, that's not where the inflation is. Where is the inflation? The inflation is coming primarily in healthcare, in college tuition and fees, childcare, and a number of other categories. But in terms of the things that people really spend money on, those big categories of healthcare, childcare, and college tuition, and also housing. And housing in particular is important because what happens when the Fed prints all these dollars, a lot of that goes into the housing market. You want to know why the housing market is really strong when interest rates are really low? Because it makes it easier for everyone to borrow money to buy homes, right? And that makes housing more expensive. And so even though our economy overall has done well, average household income has gone up, we've outperformed Europe in this regard. If you actually ask people making $40,000 a year how they're doing, they'll tell you they're not doing that well. Their living standards have actually declined on certain measures because of the rising cost of healthcare and housing and these other factors. So it was in that context that we started the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity in 2016. Our mission is to expand economic opportunity to those who least have it using the tools of individual liberty, free enterprise, technological innovation, and pluralism. Because our argument is that you can solve these problems, these threats to living standards, through more competition, more freedom, reducing the cost of living for people, increasing social mobility, increasing economic growth. That is obviously not the view of everyone, right? There are people out there, and people you'll hear from at this conference, who have a different view as to how we can address these economic challenges that Americans face. But that's our perspective. And so one of the things that we do is all of our scholars work exclusively on policy ideas that meaningfully improve the lives of Americans whose incomes or wealth are below the US median, using reforms that are pro-liberty, pro-economic freedom. and our structure is that of a standard think tank like many of the think tanks you know. We've been grateful for a lot of the coverage that our work has gotten in the press. I'll highlight one write-up from the Washington Post that came out when we launched FreeOp that noted that there are plenty of think tanks devoted to free markets, and there are plenty of think tanks devoted to inequality. But there were no think tanks that blended those two aspirations. That how are we going to address inequality of opportunity using economic freedom? That's the thing that FreeOp does. And while we're maybe the think tank of, and there are a handful of others out here in this room that work on these issues in similar ways, we're one of the think tanks that has this focus that's pretty rare, if not unique. There are a lot of scholars and activists and writers and thinkers who care about these same issues and look at them in the same way, which is why we have this conference, so that all of you can learn from each other and we can all learn from the best new thinking that emerges from this synthesis of believing that freedom can achieve progress, as Frederick Douglass did, as Martin Luther King did. We work on 12 major policy areas. A lot of them have to do with the big drivers of cost of living for Americans, like housing, healthcare, energy, post-secondary education. We also work on pre-K and K through 12 education. We work on criminal justice reform. Dan Lips, who is somewhere here, was the inventor of the concept of education savings accounts in 2005. And we are delighted that this evening we'll be able to honor at this conference two of the leaders that have made incredible progress on education savings accounts and education choice over the last 2 years, Betsy DeVos and Arizona Governor Doug Ducey. I want to also highlight the panels that we're having today. We've obviously got a lot of content for you over the next couple of days. And what this agenda is meant to do is it's meant to help us think through all of these questions, right? How can we increase social mobility through freedom? A big part of the way you do that is by reducing cost of living. If you're making $40,000 a year, a lot of people want to talk about income inequality, right? But $40,000 in California and $40,000 in Dallas are very different, because the cost of living in Dallas is so much lower than the cost of living in San Francisco, right? So it's not just how much money you're making, it's how much money is left over after you pay your taxes and pay your rent and pay your healthcare bills. It's not just how much money you're making today, it's how much money you have the opportunity to make in the future through job growth and wage growth. So that's the economic side of the argument. It's also really important for us to think about the cultural arguments, the political arguments. How is it in a world in which so many people are so sour about America, and it seems like so many people involved in politics are at each other's throats and can't agree on anything? How do we persuade more people to believe in these values? Actually, a lot of people already do believe in these values, right? I think one of the things that's telling about Martin Luther King's speech is how much he cited the Founding Fathers, how much he cited the great unifying principles of America. And he persuaded a lot of people, right? Again, it was controversial what he was arguing for in 1963, and yet today it's something that all of us embrace. We're also going to talk about foreign policy. That's not something that FreeOp specifically works on, but we do, I think as a movement, obviously need to think about what is the role of the United States in advancing freedom around the world or protecting freedom around the world? How does freedom in other parts of the world affect the interests of Americans? These are topics that are obviously controversial today and topics that deserve our time and thinking. And so we're going to have some outstanding panels from really thoughtful and knowledgeable people on those topics. One thing I want to highlight as well is the fact that there are policy victories. You know, again, so much of the conversation on both the left and the right, but particularly on the right, is about how everything is falling apart. And look, we've talked about some of the challenges economically that we face in this country. But there have also been real victories. Education choice is a great example. We have actually managed to persuade people of the value of our ideas, and millions of parents, millions of children are going to benefit from those ideas over the ensuing decades. It is not a lost cause to invest in freedom and progress. In fact, it is the only way to expand the constituency for our values. I was talking to some people on the hallway, and one of the arguments you hear is, well, you just can't persuade anybody anymore. You just have to basically win. and defeat the other side. You have to own the libs or defeat the right or whatever it is. But what the education choice movement shows us, and so many other issues that we'll talk about over the next 2 days, is that it is possible to persuade people who aren't already with you to support your ideas if they believe that you are your brother's keeper, that you're not merely saying, I'm for freedom because I want to be left alone and keep my stuff, but I am for freedom because I want to make your life better. And it's only when we devote ourselves to that cause of how we use freedom to make others' lives better that freedom gains its nobility as an enterprise, an intellectual and political enterprise. So just some key housekeeping items for the rest of the day. If you haven't already, download the SCED app on your phone and snap the QR code that you see in the hallways to get the agenda for the conference. You can get all the information about the breakout sessions as well there. The Wi-Fi is available if you go to Hyatt Meeting and enter the code FREOP23 when the prompt comes up. If you want to tweet about the event or X about the event or whatever it is these days, if you can use the hashtag FP2023, please do. Obviously, we have the Frederick Douglass Award dinner tonight. It is sold out, but there are, if you're on the wait list for the dinner, please let us know, and our team will let you know what the status of that is. I also want to thank our sponsors, Arnold Ventures, the John William Pope Foundation, the Bitcoin Policy Institute, the Independent Women's Forum, and NICM. We're so grateful for all of our donors, many of whom are here, the people who've made FREOP possible. We're so grateful to all of you for having faith in this crazy idea when we launched this thing in 2016, that it could come to fruition today and have the impact that we've been able to have as an institution in some of the legislative and policy victories that we've had at FREOP. I want to close with this thought and this idea for the next 2 days. Again, what Martin Luther King tried to do was really hard. It didn't seem like it was possible for a long time. He had to persuade a lot of people to vote for things that they didn't think were in their interests. But he appealed to classic American principles that everyone believed in, to persuade a lot of people on a very polarized. You think things are polarized now? They were pretty polarized in 1964, I promise you. They were pretty polarized in 1863. We have been far more polarized as a country in the past than we have been today. So if anybody in this room is feeling sorry for yourself about how hard things are or how hard it is to persuade people of different ideas, I promise you there are lots of people in the world who've done harder things in our country, in our own lifetimes in many cases, right? So one thing I want you to think about for the next 2 days is, how do we persuade people to come alongside us? How do we show people that freedom can achieve progress for their lives, help them achieve their aspirations? And how do we address the genuine and meaningful criticisms of the status quo that people who are critical of a free society articulate? It's important to engage those criticisms and not merely dismiss them. I think if we do that, we're going to come out of that debate stronger. There's a lot of division right now among people on the right, people on the left, about exactly what America should stand for. And the solution for us is that we represent something that the majority of the country believes in. The majority of the country wants freedom. The march that Martin Luther King delivered his speech, that's I Have a Dream speech on, was called the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Jobs and freedom. We stand for jobs and freedom. We stand for economic progress, and we stand for economic freedom. This is something that, again, is a unifying message that a lot of people can believe in. If we write people off because of their zip code or their ancestry, we deserve to fail. And this is a movement of people that will never write anyone off. Don't give up on any single American, and let's show over the next 2 days that we are thinking about every single person who lives in this country and how to make their lives better. Thank you.